And joining me right now is Research Director of the Government Accountability Institute. He's the author of, get this, Fraud, How the Left Plans to Steal the Next Election. Of note, this was published in August of 2018, okay? And he's also the producer of The Creepy Line. It's a documentary that exposes the power of big tech and how much power they have over public opinion. So much to talk about. He really does get into the weeds about what's happened and what could happen. And with censorship, what happened with this election. He predicted it back in 2018. Eric Eggers, how are you?
Well, Rose, I'm great, especially since the fact that I live in Florida and, you know, my in-laws literally arrived about an hour ago, but I can drink as much as I want whenever I want, so I'm fine.
That is so mean for you to bring that up right now. He's living in the free state of Florida. That's right. Oh, my gosh. I mean, this is insanity. It really is. And, you know, Eric, I have to say, it is weird. It's really strange when you are on the turnpike or you're on major highways here in Pennsylvania. I feel like I'm in the movie Outbreak or something weird like that, like some kind of sci-fi movie, and I see all these signs, these LED signs that say, you must be quarantined if you enter this state. You must have the mask on. You know, it's just like weird. It's so weird. Really weird.
Totally weird. It's really weird, and, you know, what's really sort of bizarre about it is, you know, to kind of connect it to, you know, the topics you mentioned earlier, is, you know, we know, and when I wrote the book about, you know, election fraud and some of the security issues that we have and that are documented that we know exist, you know, that's all pre this new COVID reality, right? So that's all pre California legalizing ballot harvesting, which sort of normalized the idea and practice of third-party solicitation and collection of ballots. And it's also pre this massive increase in mailing people ballots, and have seen a massive increase in vote by mail. So it is super bizarre that in the name of, I mean, we're losing lots of freedoms, right, in the name of the COVID era, you know, not the least of which is your freedom to be able to imbibe whenever you'd like to. And I think one of those freedoms, unfortunately, may be the freedom to have confidence in the outcome of American elections.
Yeah, and that's the scariest thing, right? I mean, it shouldn't matter to you if you voted for a Democrat or a Republican. What should matter to you is that this can be done. And even a year after you wrote your book, Fraud, How the Left Plans to Steal the Next Election, even a year after you wrote that, you know, in 2019, we had Democrats that came out and said, oh, we're a little concerned about Dominion and how it could transfer votes. But now they're silent. They are completely silent because the election went their way. So seemingly anyway right now. Here's the thing that concerns me. You know, we have a guy, you know, out this way on the western side of the state. There's two counties here in Pennsylvania that are of great concern. Always Philadelphia, okay? Philadelphia County, and then Allegheny County. Now, when you have someone say to you, who should know better, oh, you know, we always have fraud, and I didn't see anything. Well, how the hell did you see anything if you weren't being allowed or permitted to see anything? And in particular, you know, in fact, it was Rudy Giuliani that spoke about those two counties and the number of mail-in ballots that we had that were like outrageously high numbers, almost, you know, over 700,000 of them just between those two counties. Don't you tell me that there's nothing weird going on this time around. I'm sorry.
Well, absolutely, right? And then you know this if you're a resident of Pennsylvania, but, you know, this is not the first time Pennsylvania's had hard questions asked about the integrity of their elections. I mean, in 2016, their Secretary of State actually, you know, initially sort of resigned quietly, and subsequent reporting by the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette said that no, in fact, he was fired for presiding over what were documented to be what they called glitches in the system that allowed illegal votes to be cast by non-citizens or illegal immigrants, right? I mean, Pennsylvania, you know, Philadelphia, that you mentioned, had an elections judge, someone who's employed to ensure the integrity and accuracy of American elections, and he was arrested and charged with literally voter fraud because he was accepting bribes to stuff ballots on behalf of the candidates that paid him, right? So it's not like Pennsylvania when you say, oh, can you imagine the idea that you know, there might be some questions about what happens here? No, unfortunately, this is just sort of the next chapter, if you will, in Pennsylvania's history. Now, that's not to say that the people don't try hard to do their best to make sure, you know, that election outcomes are secure. We all saw, I think, Al Schmidt on the 60 Minutes thing, but because of the way the system is set up, and I think this is what you're touching upon, not just in terms of the lack of ability to observe, but the lack of assessment of the accuracy of the voter rolls, right? So the reality is once somebody's registered to vote, then they're going to be able to cast that ballot whether or not they're a legal voter. And so, I mean, that's just an example of like one of the many thresholds that I think needs examining and addressing as we move forward.
You know, one of the things that a lot of people ask me is, you know, once some of these states, after the Secretary of States have certified the election results, can the litigation still go forward? And I believe that it can. And I talked a little bit about it earlier, but there is some great concern because there's some really interesting things that have been uncovered. I've been talking to a lot of the lawyers on the ground, particularly here in the state of Pennsylvania, and they worked so hard, really hard, and they had to process a lot of information before they could go forward with anything. And you want to know that at least this is being given serious consideration and that it's being looked at. I mean, what is the process? What do we do from here? What can we hope for from here?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's such an important point. And, I actually talk about some of the Pennsylvania attorneys, and there's some excellent attorneys in the state of Pennsylvania specifically who are great at election law. And because what they're fighting for, right, is not just to make sure that this most recent election has accurate results, but they're fighting to make sure that the laws that were in place the day of the election stay in place for the remainder of the outcome, not just now, but in the future. That's always sort of the tension point that lawyers fight about, right? It's like, hey, were we able to get them to change or weaken certain security thresholds in the middle of the election? Because once that happens, then that's like the new standard as they move forward, and that's unfortunate. I think we've seen a pattern of that, over the last several cycles. As it relates to like what can we hope for? Well, I'm old enough to remember an election this century that was decided by 537 votes in Florida specifically, and not only did it take 37 days before the presidential candidate that was on the wrong side of that, Al Gore, conceded. But then, and this is what's really crazy, is not even after he conceded, lots of news outlets then went out and conducted their own investigation, right? The New York Times, the Orlando Sentinel, these other things, like well after and into the George W. Bush administration. So what I think we can hope for is that we're allowed, just as a country, as a democracy, right, to be able to conduct as much of an investigation and just to kind of do a thorough analysis that doesn't necessarily rely on the competence of the people that are currently representing, Donald Trump's legal team, but kind of just like real experts that do a thorough analysis. I mean, historically, when people have proven documented evidence of voter fraud, it's taken actual investigations. It sometimes can take years. So I think because that's just sort of the way the system's set up, and that's what it looks like to actually do that level of forensic accounting and investigation. So what I'd like to see is the system's given time to play itself out, that we can sort of really get answers to some of the questions that are being raised right now.
Yeah, that makes sense. We're on a slippery slope right now, and when you consider that, we are at risk, we're losing the confidence in a free election, free enterprise with all the shutdowns and so forth, but also free speech, and we're seeing a lot of censorship. And I know you're the producer of the Creepy Line. Right now, I mean, a lot of people, the left is freaking out over Parler. By the way, my Parler is Rose Unplugged, but they're freaking out over Parler. Because people are going over there by the millions. Politico the other day took Parler to task because they don't censor enough. They want that competition to go away. And that's astounding to me. And speaking of not censoring enough, when we had those hearings on censorship, Dorsey, and by the way, if he was in the car of the E train in New York, I'm not getting in, okay? I mean, if I didn't know who he was, I wouldn't get in there. But they're asking, their representatives are asking, the Republican representatives are saying, why are you censoring so much? While the Democrats are saying, why aren't you censoring more? So I just don't understand how so many people can be okay with this, Eric.
No, it's exactly right. I mean, and think about what we were just talking about as far as what the reaction was after the 2000 election, where not only did people sort of like not accept the results for 37 days, but then even after there was a concession, these media outlets went out and did their own independent investigation to say, well, did George W. Bush really win? And what we're experiencing right now, just 20 years later, is completely the opposite, right? We were totally conditioned by social media outlets and news websites even ahead of the election. Say, listen, heads up, it may take several days to count all the votes. that means that the system is working exactly as it's supposed to. Like, that's what we all were told and fed and all the many screens that we see. And then as soon as the election was over, a couple of days later, and once, we saw a shift in terms of the leader, then we were told, no, you not only cannot ask questions or like raise concerns given the documented history of electoral fraud that we know exists, but if you do that, like, A, we're going to flag it, right? B, we might delete it, and then now some of these social media sites are even adding additional articles to sort of like what they would say is the correct narrative surrounding some of these topics. So it's very troubling. And I think it doesn't augur good things because if you think about it, right, American democracy, like the reason why we will have a peaceful transition of power, right, is because everyone generally believes, okay, like this is how adults do it. This is what democracy looks like. It's hard, but it's good. And but everybody has to have the ability and the belief in their ability to sort of say what they think, freedom of speech, and that's very much going away.
Oh, it's very much going away. And everyone should be concerned about that. Everyone should be concerned about that. It was George Washington that said, if the freedom of speech is taken away, then dumb and silent we may be led like sheep to the slaughter. And that is exactly what could happen. And he understood that, and we should understand that. And it frightens me that we don't. I have to go, but Eric Eggers, I really appreciate you, author of Fraud, How the Left Plans to Steal the Next Election. Wow, were you prescient or what? And also producer of The Creepy Line. Thank you so much, Eric, for joining us today.
My pleasure, Rose. Thank you.